Good morning and welcome to episode 2 of Duval Rundown. My name is Gus Logue. Before I introduce our host for today, we're going to get to some Jaguars trivia real quick, as we do at the top of every show. Trevor Lawrence won his first ever NFL game in Week 6 of the 2021 season against the Miami Dolphins. He threw one touchdown pass in that game. Who received that sole touchdown pass? Was it A, Marvin Jones, B, Laviska Shenault, C, Jamal Agnew, or D, James Robinson? Give about 3 or 4 seconds for people to think about it. Blah, 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 blah. And the correct answer is A, Marvin Jones. So a little way to get the brain stimulated this morning. We're trying to figure out whether 9:04 a.m. or noon p.m. is going to be the best time for this show. So thanks for bearing with us for now, but we'll definitely have a more consistent schedule at some point. But today, I'm very excited to welcome a second guest onto the show and someone who's going to be on every single Thursday with me. It is 1010XL's Mia O'Brien, who's the co-host of Helmets and Heels from noon to 2 on 1010XL, and she's also our director of multimedia. So, Mia, thank you for being here. Welcome.
Absolutely, Gus. Excited to hit the ground running with this. I'm so excited for what we're going to build this show into. I know it's always hard to start something because we're testing things out. Like you said, we're testing out home studio versus in studio. We're testing out graphics. We're testing out hopefully getting music and all that fun stuff eventually. But appreciate you taking this bull by the horns and getting us started in this new age of daily live podcasts at 1010XL.
Well, we've already got one comment. Ratius? Sorry, is keen to find out how the
Ratius? Is that a raccoon or a lemur in your profile pic?
Yeah. Hey, we get them all kinds of animals. This isn't just a big cat show. So, how can the Jags D handle the Dolphins running multiple different dangerous plays out of empty? We're going to get to that pretty soon. He said lemur, good eyes.
I know my zoo animals.
I wanted to bring Mia on today to, first of all, get her on for the first show, but we wanted to talk today about specifically the Jaguars defense against the Dolphins offense. The Jaguars and the defense, they have their season opener on Sunday at 1 o'clock at Hard Rock Stadium in Miami. And so with Ryan Nielsen being new and Dolphins coach Mike McDaniel being kind of an offensive boy genius, I thought this was a good way to kind of like dive into a matchup. So just starting out kind of general picture, what do you think is like the biggest 1 or 2 storylines heading into this game for Jags?
Yeah, I've continued to reiterate it for weeks now on end, Gus, that I think the biggest matchup, it's so cliche to say in the trenches, but specifically there have been questions about the Jaguars, not just their offensive line, but their interior 3, that center position, the only position that we've seen a change along the offensive line since last season, with Luke Fortner taken out of the starting lineup, free agent acquisition, Mitch Morse substituted to give stability to that front. Brandon Scherf is back at right guard after being traded for at the trade deadline. Ezra Cleveland is back at left guard. What can we expect from those 3? Because what we heard from Doug Peterson at the Combine and what has been the company line since the season ended, tragically, if I may, in Nashville last January, the company line has been, we didn't play our best 5, our ideal starting offensive line until week 18. And that is just a 1-game sample size of what this starting 5 looks like together. Now, it's kind of weird to say that that was your goal and that was your ideal starting 5 when one of those 5 didn't get here until Halloween, but I'll push that off to the side. Let's focus on that interior 3, which has been the big question mark, because I know you have high hopes for Anton Harrison. Cam Robinson is in a contract year. I expect Anton to perform admirably. Even if Cam doesn't live up to the snuff, you could argue the Jaguars have the best backup left tackle in the game with Walker Little sitting on the bench. And so the focus has been that interior 3. Interestingly enough, as we look at this matchup, the biggest question mark for the Dolphins is their interior defensive line. The loss of Christian Wilkins in free agency. Have they adequately replaced him? For me, the answer is no. Sorry, Benito. I don't believe that you are suddenly going to be plug and play and replace the production that Christian Wilkins, one of the rare unicorns in the sport, what he can offer a team between his pass rush ability, his run stuffing ability. I respect the fact that the Dolphins recognize that Bradley Chubb could miss the start of the season, as he is, and he will be out the first 4 games, including this one. And they went out and they drafted Chop Robinson out of Penn State in the first round. But Chop Robinson is number 1, an edge defender, and number 2, he's not that stout against the run. And so if the Jaguars' interior 3 and their offensive line as a whole is to have reinvented the run game like they say they have, that is where that matchup could be the difference in this game.
I've got an interesting quote for later on in the top quotes segment about the Jaguars running game and how they're thinking about reinventing that. And I think there's a similar storyline kind of for the Dolphins offensive line where, like the Jags, you said kind of like the weakness was those 3 interior spots. And it's certainly the same for the Dolphins, where they've got Teron Armstead still at left tackle, and their tackle play in general is pretty okay. But the real weakness of just the whole team, I think, is that interior offensive line. And it's similar to the Jaguars too, in that it's able to get a little bit just covered under the wraps just because their quarterback releases the ball so quickly. Last year, Trevor Lawrence and Tua Tagovailoa both were like the fastest quarterbacks in terms of time to throw and just getting the ball out quickly. And so that certainly helps to cover up some offensive line problems. But when it comes to the run game, there's certainly a lot of blown blocks or just more than you would want, and not as much kind of movement and push. And so I think that's potentially a strength versus weakness for the Jags defense. Is the strength of the Jaguars is defensive line and really whole front 7 versus the Miami offensive line, and especially the interior. In terms of storylines, I also just want to point out that Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle have been kind of nicked up with various injuries. I think Tyreek had a thumb injury at one point, maybe something a lot earlier in the season. And Waddle has been dealing with a bunch of different things, some of which hasn't been disclosed. But I was talking to Kevin Noggle from the Finsider recently, and he said like the Dolphins are very, very cautious in terms of kind of ramping up players to play. And so he definitely expects both of those guys to play like their normal selves. And so let's get into just specifically the Miami passing offense versus the Jaguars passing defense. I've got some stats pulled up. Last year, the Dolphins ranked 3rd in dropback EPA per play and 4th in dropback success rate. For those who don't know, EPA is expected points added, and it's basically a stat that just provides context because a 4-yard carry is a lot more effective on 4th and 1 than it is 2nd and 15. And so EPA kind of takes that into account, whereas traditional box scores don't. And so EPA per play is kind of, you can almost judge it as a measure of explosiveness, and then success rate you can kind of measure for down-to-down consistency. And so, again, the Dolphins ranked 3rd in EPA per play and 4th in success rate on dropbacks last season. For the Jaguars, their defense ranked 10th in EPA per play allowed on dropbacks and 21st in success rate allowed on dropbacks. And so they were able to prevent explosive plays at a decent clip, but they weren't as just efficient from down to down. And so what are you looking for with this matchup in the passing game specifically?
Yeah, I think that you kind of set the table really nicely for me, Gus. So thank you for that. I really kind of dove into not only the tendencies we saw in terms of coverage faced and formations for this Dolphins team last year in the second year under Mike McDaniel, but I also went back and looked at the defense in coverage that Ryan Nielsen ran in Atlanta last year. Now, when we talk about the Atlanta defense last year, here is your opening day roster for the Atlanta Falcons on defense. And then I want you to think in context of the Jacksonville Jaguars opening day defense we are expecting to see on Sunday. Grady Jarrett, who we know suffered an injury and missed the second half of last year along the defensive front, the anchor in Atlanta. David Onyemata, Calais Campbell, an old friend who the Jaguars, ironically, will see in this game. Bud Dupree, the starting outside linebacker opposite Arnold Edebike, the rookie out of Penn State a year ago. Caden Ellis and Troy Anderson were your 2 linebackers. That was the front 7 for Atlanta. Now, in contrast, we look to the Jacksonville Jaguars. We don't know exactly what that lineup will look like on Sunday with the way that Ryan Nielsen has shifted his defense during the preseason like hockey shifts. He also has done a great job, I think, Gus, and you can speak to this too, in giving players the opportunity during the preseason to earn a starting role by mixing and matching guys together. So for all intents purposes, though, let's read what our friend Mike Duraco of ESPN has as the official depth chart for the Jags over on ESPN.com on defense, which reads Josh Hines-Allen, Devon Hamilton, Eric Armstead, Trayvon Walker, Foye Oluokun, Devin Lloyd, Chad Muma, if we are to go front seven for front seven compared to that Atlanta defense. Needless to say, I would make the argument that the Jaguars and the personnel that Ryan Nielsen has at his disposal this year, much greater than what he had a year ago, especially once the injuries to Jarrett and company piled up over time. With that said, Ryan Nielsen still had a pretty darn good defense with what he did have in Atlanta last year, and that was despite all the dysfunction on the other side of the ball. They were 4th and 3rd down stops. They allowed 0 40-yard runs. They were 26th and 20-plus yard runs allowed. I think we're going to circle back to that when we talk about the run game. But more importantly, they were a team that consistently ranked in the top 10 across the board when it came to various defensive metrics. I really dove into, though, what scheme he was running. And so let's kind of run through the different coverages, and this is what the Atlanta Falcons ran last year. They ran cover one man 19.9% of the time. That was 15th in the league. Cover two, more of a zone defense, for those of you who are familiar, 12% of the time. That was also 15th in the league. So kind of middle of the road there. The number that jumps out is that the Atlanta Falcons ran dime or cover six, the third most of any team in the National Football League last year at 18.2% of the time. You compare that to the team that had arguably the most success against dime coverage, the third most success, as a matter of fact. Wait for it. The Miami Dolphins, who converted 12.7% of the time against dime coverage in 2023. And so that is where I'm so curious, knowing that dime coverage, Gus, is when you have your two safeties coat, so it's a half, right? So you're playing zone out in the backfield, more of a man-to-man on the other side, on the other half of the field. I'm genuinely curious to see how Ryan Nielsen lines up this defense. And we can also go through the different offensive formations the Dolphins ran last year and what we can expect from them this year, because we'll couple that with our conversation about the Dolphins offensive line with the fact that I don't think they really have any good tight ends on that team. And that is that's post Mike Gesicki, who, let's be real, was he really an inline blocker? No. Durham Smythe, remember when they traded for him? Is he even really an efficient inline blocker? It doesn't have to be a sexy name. It just needs to be a body. I know they have Alec Ingold at the fullback position, but at the same time, it's genuinely interesting to look at the personnel matchups, knowing that this is a team that, yes, is built for speed, but at the same time, knowing that Mike McDaniel wants to run the ball, how does that counter against a group of cyborgs that Ryan Nielsen now has at his disposal on defense, who can get from sideline to sideline, unlike the outfit he had a year ago?
I know the Dolphins offense also ranked first in usage of 21 personnel, which is 2 running backs and 1 tight end and then 2 receivers. And so that makes sense, as Mike McDaniel comes from the Kyle Shanahan coaching tree that likes to utilize a fullback like they do with Kyle Juszczyk out there in San Francisco. And so it'll be interesting to see if, like, when they go into those heavier formations with an extra running back or a fullback and Alec Ingold, if the Jaguars keep their dime defense on the field and keep like another coverage defender, like a safety or a corner out there, or if they match that like heavier personnel look with their base defense and bring more heavier bodies and like linebacker types onto the field. Another kind of trend from Nielsen's defense is that he ran a ton of press coverage. And so he also ran a lot of man, but a lot of that is kind of like zone match based stuff that kind of like there's a little bit of nuance between man and zone, but he runs a ton of press coverage. And so I think that's actually a really good matchup for the Jaguars, because Brandon Staley's Chargers kind of put the blueprint out on the Dolphins. I mentioned this on the last show. I forget if it was last year or the year before, but Brandon Staley's Chargers just pressed the crap out of Miami's receivers, and that really screwed up the timing of the passing offense, which is really critical because, as I explained Tuesday, the kind of secret sauce of Miami's offense, at least its passing offense, is just the speed of their receivers allows them to get to intermediate and deep concepts in the amount of time that it usually takes for short concepts, which just makes it extremely hard for pass rushers to get to Tua Tagovailoa, especially with this kind of quick trigger and really get anticipation. But because the Jaguars are expected to press so much with Ryan Nielsen, I think that Ronald Darby and Tyson Campbell, who are physical corners, as well as Darnell Savage in the slot, will be able to kind of like disrupts the dynamic, albeit smaller sized receivers in Tyreek and Waddle and that stuff.
Let's talk about that press at the line, Gus, because we tried yesterday to get it out of Ronald Darby in the locker room during availability. He allowed Tyreek. Yeah, he gave up just one. He surrendered one catch to Tyreek Hill for 5 yards in the Baltimore Ravens meeting with the Miami Dolphins last year. He was not giving any secrets away yesterday. We were trying our best. You can look at that interview. It's right here on the 1010XL Jaguars channel. But my question for you is, there has been so much made of Tyson Campbell, number one, getting an extension this offseason. But number two, is he a press man corner? Is he physical enough at the line? I know you've done a lot of deep dives, shout out Urban Meyer, into if he fits that personnel skill set or not. We clearly know that that's what Darby is, and that's why they brought him in. And we know that that's what Darnell Savage brings, and that's why he was brought in. I'm curious, how do you think this personnel group for the Jaguars matches up at the line of scrimmage for the secondary against the Tyreek Hills and Jalen Waddles of the world? Can they jam them at the line?
Yeah, I think so. I think I definitely have confidence in Tyson. I think he might, almost similar to Darius Williams, he might be better in off coverage, or at least not press. And it's not because he's worse at press, but it's just because he's so good at kind of playing zone coverage and reading out what's in front of him, and then using his athleticism and instincts to make a quick break on the ball. But he definitely has the size and the physicality to line up and press. And when there's been like limited sample sizes of him playing in press for the past 3 years for the Jaguars, but the film has been good, and he's definitely, I think, his biggest weakness coming out of college was just playing the ball in the air at the catch point. And that's still something that he could continue improving, but he's definitely come a long way, and so that'll help. And so I think he's going to be able to do his job, and same with the rest of the cornerbacks in terms of just disrupting receivers at the line of scrimmage. And it's really going to be important for them to win the first 1 or 2 seconds of the reps. And then I think it's actually kind of an underrated storyline, just how important the safeties are going to be for the Jaguars in this game, because like their job is basically to win the last 1 or 2 seconds of the rep. And like, because I think Tyreek and Jalen, like they're so good, and Mike McDaniel is so good at scheming them up, that they're going to get loose at some point in the game. But for the safeties especially, they need to make sure that they actually wrap up and prevent yards after the catch. And I know that was definitely kind of a main talking point from the locker room yesterday, and just with the team in general this week.
Absolutely. To the point about offensive formations for the Dolphins last year, you brought up the idea of them running 11 personnel more than anybody else. I think the actual formations they ran kind of bring both of our points together. They were third in 2-by-1 formations a year ago. Thank you, John Osher's burner. We love you too. They were, and which ironically, the Falcons were first in 2-by-1 formations. So that just gives you an idea of what Ryan Nielsen was going up against in practice every day in Atlanta last year. But interestingly enough, despite being third overall in that category, they were first when it came to having no tight end help on either side. So literally having 2 wide receivers with no tight end chipping on one side, and then 1 wide receiver wide open on the other side. They were also number 1 in having that one-on-one matchup, and also having tight end coverage as well. And so that, coupled with ranking number 1 in 3-by-2 formations, AKA having 3 trips and then a slot out to one side, it says to me you, yes, are going to see a lot of other 11 personnel, more 11 personnel this year as well. Especially, we were talking yesterday on Helmets and Heels with one of the members of the Miami media contingent, and he said this looks exactly like the Miami that we saw not only at the end of last year, but in last year's training camp as well. It's not like the disappointing 3-game losing streak to end the season changed how Mike McDaniel and his outfit do things. It's not like they said, you know what, we need to get heavier, we need to get tougher at the line of scrimmage like the Jags did. This is the same personnel largely running it back and saying, we lost our 2 best edge defenders last year. If we can keep them healthy, and if we can be healthy throughout the course of the season, then we will have a better result, as opposed to saying, hey, it's great to have the greatest show on turf, but if you go back and you look at that St. Louis Rams team of 1999, they also were pretty darn good in the trenches and on defense too.
Yeah, well, this Miami team has been nicknamed the greatest show on surf, rather than the Rams being the greatest show on turf. So let's get to the running game. What do you like in terms of the matchup for the Jaguars' defensive run game versus Miami's rushing offense?
Yeah, let's run through some more numbers for that Miami offense to kind of set the table for us. They were number 1 last year in yards per carry at 5.1 yards per clip. They also ranked first in rushing touchdowns. I think that was an underrated storyline nationally last year because, again, to your point, everyone was so focused on Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle. You forget Raheem Mostert, double-digit touchdowns from a year ago. And I even think so many people have focused on Devon Achane and locked in on him as not only a fantasy football darling, but as a guy who could really do some damage for this Miami team out of the backfield. And you're completely forgetting this veteran who, yes, has been a journeyman at times in his career, but had 18 touchdowns last year. And so that needs to be reminded to the masses as we get set for this matchup. The Dolphins were also third in 20-plus yards per game, or 20-plus yard runs throughout the season. They had 17 20-plus yard runs, and they were first in 40-plus yard runs with 8. I bring that up to go back to what I said earlier, which is Ryan Nielsen's Atlanta Falcons defense last year. Yes, 26th in allowing 20-plus yard runs. They allowed 14. Again, the Dolphins had 17 20-plus yard runs. Do the math there. But again, that personnel, like I mentioned at the top of the show, and they also allowed 0 40-plus yard runs. And so, look, I understand the two teams didn't face each other, so a lot of this is just speculation and throwing numbers and matching them up against each other head to head. But I look again at that personnel that Ryan Nielsen had last year and what he was able to do with them. Look at the personnel he has now and say, you know what, if the Jaguars defense can be on its P's and Q's, then all the credit in the world to Trent Baalke. He will be validated because he has the personnel. They just needed to be coached by someone who is not only able to create to help them maximize their potential, but also create mismatches. And that's what I'm perhaps most excited to see, especially in the run defense.
Yeah, I think it'll specifically for Eric Armstead. I mean, for Trayvon Walker, since he was drafted, there's been talk about him moving inside and playing a little bit more from the interior because he's just a little bit more explosive when he has a hand in the dirt and is able to get off the line of scrimmage or get off the ball from a 3-point stance as opposed to a 2-point stance. But Eric Armstead has been kind of rumored to be essentially the third edge player for the Jaguars defense, even though he was primarily a defensive tackle in his 9 years in San Francisco. And so I think those two guys, obviously Josh Hines-Allen is in that equation too, of kind of, it'll be interesting to see what mismatches Nielsen is able to create with them in terms of stunts and games. And usually you think of that in the passing game, but it certainly happens in the running game too. And so for every down, that's going to be something to look out for.
I was going to say one other sneaky stat to look for, and maybe it's not a surprise, although the second stat I have for you maybe makes a little bit of a question. The Dolphins were tied for first in rushing fumbles last year. Not to wish ill will upon the Fins. They had 13 fumbles when running the ball a year ago, not in space. We're talking on run design plays. And so, or design run plays, excuse me. So that is where I'm curious, knowing maybe we could combine the teachings of Bob Sutton and think takeaways from a year ago, Gus. We can combine that with Ryan Nielsen and the high IQ defense that the Jaguars are expected to run this year. Not that it wasn't high IQ last year, but a lot more intricate, let's say. I am curious. Again, that is where if you're Trent Baalke, you will be validated if the cyborg outfit you've put together on that side of the ball is able to punch it out against the likes of a Devon Achane or a Raheem Mostert. Interestingly enough, and this is something that I think maybe is a conversation for another time, when you look at the McVay tree, which Mike McDaniel, of course, comes from, it's so fascinating how they utilize the run game. And part of that is obviously your personnel. It's a little bit different when Kyle Shanahan has, Christian McCaffrey at his disposal. Shout out to Sean McVay for turning Kyren Williams, a 5th-round pick, into the bell cow that he did a year ago. The Dolphins were 12th in running the ball on first down last year. And that is interesting to me because Mike McDaniel, Bobby Slowick, I feel like, Slowick's an offense coordinator, so maybe he's a rung below on the McVay-Shanahan tree. Mm-hmm. But he was very open this offseason about the fact that, well, yes, Houston couldn't run the ball last year. He continued to pound the rock because that is such an essential foundation of that offensive scheme. And so knowing the personnel that Mike McDaniel has, especially if Achane is healthy, if Mostert is healthy, a different skill set perhaps than Kyren Williams. But I'm curious to see if that number has an uptick this year and if that is perhaps where we see the evolution of this Dolphins offense.
Yeah, it's definitely, I meant to say this at the top when we were going into the rushing offense, but the Miami Dolphins definitely do as well a job as any team in the league in terms of kind of marrying their run and pass concepts together. And that's really one of the strengths of like the Shanahan/McVay coaching tree, is that obviously kind of like the scheme and the system itself is really nice. But what really makes it pop is being able to sequence plays and kind of like set up plays for later. So like, even if you're going to have like first down runs that aren't super successful all the time, if you're able to kind of like
lull them asleep.
Yeah, if you can cram that outside zone and then just like get two on a bootleg to Jalen Waddle wide open for 25 yards, it kind of makes it worth it.
Which, by the way, the Dolphins third in outside zone snaps a year ago, 46% of the time. I would expect that number to increase in A-Chain's second year in the league.
Yeah, I'll be interested to see, because I think that for both A-Chain and Mostert, outside zone is kind of like the best fit for them. And it's kind of the best fit for just what McDaniel wants to do with offense in general. But we have seen, not just across the league, but also with Shanahan McVay very recently, like transitioning to more gap runs and more power runs and kind of like up the middle to try to be more assertive and more, not more physical, but on gap and power runs, you're really like blocking at the defenders and going towards them. And on zone runs, you're kind of going more laterally and just trying to like open up space. And so I definitely think outside zone is going to be the majority of what we see from Miami on Sunday. But I'll also be interested to see if they kind of mix up a couple just power runs in there.
It's a copycat league, and you hit the nail on the head. Like, McVay reinvented himself last year, and so that's why, as much as yes, we've heard from the media contingent in Miami that things haven't looked all that different, I am curious if we see an evolution of that offense on Sunday.
One stat I have for you is, according to Sports Info Solutions, the Dolphins ranked first in both motion usage, pre-snap motion usage, and play action usage. And they ranked top 5 in success rate for both. And so that's another thing that McDaniel and kind of the Shanahan system does really well, is using motion for a purpose. And so usually motion, like, you have to have a reason for it. You don't just run it to run it. But the reason that some teams run it just to run it is just to kind of like create some pre-snap confusion for defenders. Like if there's a player, especially a very fast player like Tyreek Hill or Jalen Waddle, going in formation across a formation, or going in motion across a formation, or even if they're just going in motion like a couple of yards, that can kind of like disrupt coverage rules and make defenders just kind of freeze and think for a split second, and that can buy a ton of time. Some sort of similar for play action, where like when you fake the run, it just makes defenders freeze for a half second, and that's enough to be able to like get something over linebackers' heads or something. But for the motion, what McDaniel does specifically really well to kind of like set it up and have a purpose for it is just to create angles. We saw that with like the quote unquote cheat motion that Tyreek Hill ran last year, and Deebo Samuel did it in San Francisco, where it was basically they would run a dig route, but they would kind of like go in motion to almost like get some steam going and get some acceleration before the snap and just turn up field. And then those guys are, even without acceleration helping them in motion, they're so hard to cover. But then in the running game, McDaniel is just kind of a genius at creating angles and using motion to kind of like get people in the right path and just like set up his blockers so that it's going to be a good path for his ball carrier. And so, like I mentioned on Tuesday's show, McDaniel was really known as being kind of like the orchestrator of San Francisco's run offense for a while. And now obviously he's pretty popular for all the fun passing concepts because he has Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle, but he's definitely like someone to look out for when it comes to rushing offense.
And I think the motion is going to show itself it'll present the most challenges for the Jaguars defense when Tyreek goes in motion in the backfield, because the whole goal in doing so is to make it more difficult for opposing defenses to try to track him down and follow him. I mean, essentially, in layman's basketball terms, by having him cut across the line of scrimmage in the backfield, you're forcing the opposing defender to have to, quote unquote, come around screens in basketball terms. And so that is where I look at that, combined with our conversation about trying to, lock up Tyreek Hill at the line of scrimmage. And I'll compare it to unfortunately what happened with the Jags on offense last year with Calvin Ridley. Part of why Calvin Ridley had struggles last year, I know he still had 1,000 yards, credit to him. Part of why he struggled was because the Jaguars were expecting him to win one-on-one at the line. Tyreek Hill can win one-on-one at the line of scrimmage, but Mike McDaniel still says, I'm going to make it a little bit easier for you. We're going to create some window dressing that'll allow for you to get open and actually get out into open space a lot easier than having to try to beat somebody at the line of scrimmage.
All right, Mia. Last question for you. I asked for 2 X factors before the show, but just give me 1 X factor from either side of the ball, from the Jags defense or the Fins offense, that'll have a big impact on this season opener.
Yeah, so let's start with the Jags. It's got to be Eric Armstead. It is the biggest question mark coming into this game, and it's a good question mark so long as things actually go according to plan. Eric Armstead is not expected to be kept on a snap count, according to Doug Peterson from his press conference yesterday. He is expected to be a full go. I am fascinated to see where the Jaguars line him up at. Obviously, throughout the course of his decade-long career, he is predominantly lined up at the 3 tech or the 5 tech position. There has been this notion of late that part of why he came to Jacksonville was the opportunity to rush the passer off the edge a little bit more. I'm curious, and I'm not really in the weeds in terms of the medical side of this and the biological, as your body's wearing down and you're getting older, being on the edge, is that less wear and tear? I don't know if that's the case and if that's part of what is so eager and so enticing for Armstead. But what I do know is I think from what he has said, it's this opportunity to move up and down the line freely. And not that he wasn't allowed to do that in San Francisco, but it does sound like Ryan Nielsen's going to give him that opportunity here in Jacksonville. And so very excited and very eager. And honestly, I have no expectations, but I have lots of expectations when it comes to the veteran free agent signee and what he can do for the Jaguars on Sunday. And let's pick, I never thought I'd say this, but let's pick his predecessor / the player who everyone has compared him to here in Jacksonville. And that would be the mayor, who I know has already gotten a shout out in our MyBookie Digital Studio chat line a couple times here on the program. That would be Calais Campbell. Look, he turned 36 this month, right? I think he's 36, 37. He is in the twilight of his career. There is no doubt. Let's bring this show full circle, Gus. I have legitimate questions, regardless of how good Chop Robinson looks off the edge, regardless of how good Jalen Phillips looks coming off of a torn Achilles. I have legitimate questions about the Dolphins' interior defensive line. Who is going to stop the run? Can the Jaguars run the ball? Is that a case of the Jaguars' run offense significantly improving year over year? Or is it because that is the mismatch that they identify and they try to exploit? I expect Calais Campbell to rotate inside more simply because I don't think the Dolphins have horses for courses at this juncture. 38. Thank you, Rateus, because yeah, I didn't want, look, I'm giving the mayor 2 years here. We pretend COVID didn't happen. 2020 didn't happen. Everyone gets to subtract a year or two. I'm actually 29. I'm not 31. But no, I expect Calais to have to rotate inside a lot more. And that's not just, what he did in Jacksonville or what he did in Baltimore, where he was rotating inside on 3rd down from the big end spot. I expect him to have to play almost a defensive tackle position solely because, and again, let's pull it up here. I just look at this Dolphins depth chart, Gus, and this is their interior of their defensive line. Benito Jones, Brandon Peely, Calais Campbell, Deshaun Hand. That's it. That's the interior of their defensive line.
Well, my X factor actually for the Jaguars is Devon Hamilton, where certainly their interior defensive line isn't as weak as the Dolphins, but I feel fairly confident that Armstead, Hines Allen, and Trayvon Walker will kind of get the job done in terms of setting the edge and being able to slow down relatively that outside zone scheme that we see from the Dolphins. But with the Jaguars transitioning from a 3-4 defense to a 4-3, it's going to be a lot more dirty work for the defensive tackles in terms of maintaining two gap integrity, and as opposed to only worrying about one gap. And so if Devon Hamilton is able to kind of regain his 2022 form after having somewhat of a lost season last year with a offseason back injury, if he is able to kind of clog up the middle and just make life difficult and allow the Jaguars to kind of have more bodies in the secondary and kind of playing deep as opposed to needing to load the box to stop the run, I think they'll go a long way. And then for the Dolphins, my X factor is Jonnu Smith, actually. I know you said earlier that there's not a lot of scary.
I forgot. We're same wavelength. I actually just looked up because I was like, I should probably put a asterisk and an amendment on that. Durham Smythe is still on the Dolphins, but Jonnu Smith is clearly the tight end one for them.
I was actually going to say, I certainly don't blame anyone who's watching or even you, for not remembering that he signed with the Dolphins in the offseason. But I just think that he was utilized pretty well with Arthur Smith in Atlanta. And then obviously, like we know kind of the story with the New England offensive coaching staff because of Mac Jones. It was not a great situation. And so now he comes to Miami. And I don't think he's going to end up being like a top 5 or even top 10 tight end in terms of production for the year. But I do think that he's going to have more of a role in this offense than Mike Gesicki. He's been talked up a little bit in the offseason from Miami beat reporters. And McDaniel is one of those guys that always comes out with like something hot and something new, a new wrinkle for his offense in the first couple of weeks of the season. And so I would not be surprised if part of that wrinkle is just involving Johnny Smith in a new and creative way. So
Smith, 3 career touchdowns against the Jags, 8-2. Part of that, of course, is he, was drafted by the Tennessee Titans. So that helps. He also did go against Ryan Nielsen every single day in practice last year. So maybe there's something that Nielsen knows from his time in Atlanta that we do not.
There you go. All right, Mia, before we get you out of here, you got a score prediction or any final takes to get off?
Oof. Well, I do anticipate a shootout, and that's not a knock on Ryan Nielsen and this defense. I think that they're gonna surprise some folks. I think that they will hold this Miami Dolphins offense at bay, but those explosive plays, they're hard to avoid. I believe my bookie still has this line hovering around 4-3, somewhere between 3.5 and 4.5. That's most major sports books right now. I do think the Jags can surprise a lot of folks in this game, but this game 1 for the Miami Dolphins the last 2 years has been the game of the week in the National Football League. Mike McDaniel's latest and greatest creations on full display. So I am going to go Fins with that little note of I do believe the Jags could surprise a lot of people in this game. I'll go Fins 30-26.
All right. I'm on a similar wavelength. I think it won't be quite as high scoring. I was thinking like 28-24 Dolphins, where I think that I think the Jaguars definitely had the potential to surprise a lot of people in week 1. But as you're saying, like getting Mike McDaniel in week 1 is a really tough draw. And so it's almost like I feel like I got to see it to believe it, just because there's been so much hype with the Jaguars and just being in Jacksonville. I'm afraid I'm kind of like too close to it. And so I'm trying to step back a little bit and just give the Dolphins their due. But I'm just defaulting to it's week 1 Mike McDaniel, and not that I'm going to believe Vegas entirely, because I also think, well, regionally here, Gus, you're right. The hype is real for this defense. Nationally, I don't think they're getting respect. And so perhaps that's why Vegas is going a certain way with this. And that therein lies why I'm going to say Miami, but won't be surprised if, you see Jaguars 28, Dolphins 17 flash on ESPN's Bottom Line on Monday. For sure. All right, Mia, thank you for coming on. That was a great first time, and looking forward to having you back every Thursday.
Absolutely. Thanks, Gus.
All righty, and now it's time for, let's see if I can change this up real quick, our top quotes.
Excited to go out there and just see Mitch play. I feel like Mitch is going to bring a great intensity to the offensive line, and just the way that he like just on our grenade, just the way that he kind of just get out in open field. I feel like he's very fast, he's very quick, and I feel like I love that. Like having a refrigerator running in front of me.
Now that's a top quote. That was Travis Etienne talking about Mitch Morse. He said it's like having a refrigerator running in front of me. So that's pretty great. But I also just thought it was an interesting quote because a lot of quotes about Mitch Morse's addition this offseason have been, oh, he's such a great leader. He's so good in terms of communication. I think he's going to like add some kind of intensity to the offense. And so just hearing Travis talk about Mitch more specifically on the field, especially because like Mitch Morse is a great puller and is able to like just execute blocks in space really well. And so I think that's going to be an interesting facet of the Jaguars, mostly running offense, but just offense in general, is just how much they're able to use really all 5 of their starting offensive linemen in space and use different pullers. And so excited to see what Mitch Morse is able to do in his first start for the Jaguars this Sunday. Next video is Evan Ingram talking about getting nominated to be a team captain for the Jaguars, which is, I believe, the first time in his career.
what would that mean to you?
Oh, man. First time, it means a lot to me, honestly. Something I will never take lightly. Just being trying to be an example every single day, trying to lead by example, and just push guys in the right direction. And, the way this team has come together over the last couple of years that we've all been here, and all the new guys coming in, guys here, just to have that C on the chest, it means a lot to me. Something that I'm going to take head on, hold myself to a really high standard, to continue to be that example and find ways to even better myself than I am now. So definitely means to me. God has been so great in my career, and this is definitely one of the biggest blessings I've ever gotten in my career. Definitely going to take it head on.
Cool to hear Engram talking about just how much the honor means to him. He's the definition of first guy on the field, last guy out of the building type of player. And so he's definitely been captain caliber, I feel like, since he arrived in Jacksonville. As good as he is on the field, I think he's just as impressive off the field. And the Jags inside the building have just loved him as a person and his work ethic. And so he definitely deserves his flowers to get nominated as a captain. So good for Evan. This next clip is Tyson Campbell talking about his decision to change his number from 32 to 3 for this upcoming season.
3, I know you wore that in college. Just why now? Why the jersey change? Was it just that the number was available?
I won that number in Little League as well, and also represent for me the Holy Trinity, the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. So, very spiritual guy. So that meant a lot to me. It was also my favorite number. So, what perfect time to know.
Quick comment real quick. Rachis asks, are you surprised Engram got the captain nod over Cam Robinson? Not necessarily, for all the reasons I just kind of hyped up Evan Engram as a locker room leader. Cam Robinson is certainly one of those guys too. Trevor Lawrence was talking yesterday and was asked he was talking about his own personality on game days and how he's not like much of a rah guy that like gets the rest of the players super duper fired up. He's kind of just maintains his chill personality basically. But he did say that Cam Robinson and Foye Oluokun, he pointed those two players out as being like the best guys to kind of like hype up the rest of the team on game days. And so Cam Robinson is absolutely a locker room leader himself, but I'm not necessarily surprised that Engram got it. I think Engram's pretty deserving. All right, we're going to move on next to a clip from Louis Ray Zamet. He's a former European rugby player who played on the Chiefs, and he was playing in the International Player Pathway Program, if that's what it's called. And so he was released by the Chiefs, but was picked up by the Jaguars after tight end Patrick Murtaugh from Australia, who I believe also used to play rugby, unfortunately broke his ankle during training camp. And so apparently Louis is like the sixth Beatle over in the UK, so I just thought it'd be interesting to hear a little bit from him.
Yeah, I think this probably gives me the the best opportunity to really learn and continue to learn, continue to improve, and we're an exciting team, and we've got a good ambition. So I think this was probably the perfect team for me to come to.
Running back in Kansas City, receiver here. Yeah. How's that transition going for you?
I think I'm much better off playing receiver with my size and strength. I think that's probably a position that suits me a lot more. I think it was a good experiment to try running back out at the Chiefs, but I think we all realised that I'd probably be a receiver eventually, and here we are today. And, I'm loving training the receiver. I'm loving learning the role, and going to continue to improve.
All right, there you go. That's all I got. Next clip is Doug Peterson talking about Miami's offense from Monday's press conference. This video is via Jaguars YouTube.
Obviously they do a great job with that in their run game as well. And it kind of can cause you to just distort your eyes a little bit, right? And get off your cues. And that's where some of the big plays have come, for them. And obviously, we know Tyreek and Waddle and the guys. I mean, just a lot of speed and something that we've, we got to be able to at least try to match. Otherwise, be in the right position.
How much trouble can speed like that cause a defense?
I mean, they're on you fast, right? When you put the film on, these guys are on you and they're by you. And I think Tua does a great job of anticipating where the windows are and where the holes are going to be, and receivers are in the right spots.
Doug usually doesn't give away a ton of information during his pressers. That was about as in-depth as he'll go on an opponent. I understand, like, he's doesn't really gain a whole lot from doing the pressers. It's time out of his day, and he's mostly just trying to protect information rather than give away information. So I don't fault him for keeping things close to the chest. But Mike McDaniel is actually one of the most enlightening coaches I've heard talk at a presser, and so here he is on Monday via Dolphins YouTube talking about the Jaguars defense.
Defensive front jumped out at you.
I think the how they come off the ball, how they play with consistent technique and fundamentals, and their relentless strain. I think that's pretty obvious from the minimal game tape that we've watched, but that's something that's it's been a paramount in Coach Nielsen's kind of repertoire of defensive lines and defensive fronts that he's coached in previous teams. So very talented group that is playing hard and together. That's what I see on tape.
Just thought that was a pretty good answer. Only listened to one Mike McDaniel presser, but it was pretty good. The reason I listened to it actually was because he shined or gave a decent amount of hype for Brian Thomas Jr., Jacksonville's first-round pick, who apparently Miami had a good amount of interest in drafting in the first round. So here's Mike again via Dolphins YouTube. Excuse me.
Brian Thomas during the pre-draft period. What was your evaluation of him as a player?
Super talented player that has a unique combination of being able to be a down the field, third level receiver that can track and make plays down the field, while also having a route running skill set to do your underneath and intermediate routes. You see a very talented individual that can take his game as far as he wants to take it. I think it's adding to the plethora of LSU Tigers out there in the league. He's a very talented individual that we will be well aware of when he's out there on the field. It won't be a surprise because we did a lot of work on him coming out.
So McDaniel does seem to have the strategy for coach speak of just saying good things about players, especially guys on opposing teams or just opposing teams as units, and not saying anything bad. And like the bad stuff is kind of like where he thinks his team could exploit the opposition. And so that makes sense. But still, it's cool to hear such an offensive mastermind basically talk up the Jaguars as first-round rookie. I know Tony Wiggins said in his Locked On Jaguars podcast that the Dolphins were specifically interested in Brian Thomas because they wanted a size factor. Obviously, their wide receiver group is already very explosive and very talented. But as I was kind of talking to Mia about earlier, they're a little bit undersized, and that might be part of the reason. Because same goes for the running backs that they had fumbling issues last year, and so obviously McDaniel is interested in adding some size to the room, and that's actually exactly what the Jaguars were looking for too when they got both Gabe Davis and Brian Thomas this offseason. I think that'll go a long way for Trevor Lawrence, mostly just because their speed, especially Thomas Jr.'s, can kind of open up space to the rest of the offense. But I think going back to Clemson, Trevor has always been best at kind of like pinning a ball on a bigger receiver and just letting him go up and get it. And he just hasn't really had that type of receiver. I mean, Marvin Jones is that type, but he was just towards the end of his career. And so it'll be fun to see Trevor play with bigger players, bigger pass catchers this season. We got some more Brian Thomas hype coming up next. This is from a Bleacher Report show with Adam Lefkoe and former NFL wide receiver Chad Ochocinco talking about who they're going to bet on for the first touchdown scorer in Jaguars versus Dolphins.
receiver.
Listen, he's unstoppable. And knowing the Dolphins, they're not going to respect the rookie. You're going to have to prove it to us. You're going to have to force us to have to pay attention to you.
Wow.
We got to force us to have to W. So, listen, Brian Thomas is let me take my glasses off. If you're watching this, Brian Thomas is the real deal, and I have him scoring first for a reason.
So, mostly just cool to hear a legend like Ocho Cinco talk up a Jaguar. But I also thought it was interesting because he said that the Jaguars are going to be looking to get Thomas Jr. going early because you need to kind of like put something on film or put something on the field that shows defensive coordinators that you really need to respect this guy. And so I think I mentioned this on Tuesday's show too, but even I wouldn't expect necessarily like a Calvin Ridley-esque week 1 performance. Ridley had like 8 catches for 100 yards and a touchdown in week 1 last year. But I think that Brian Thomas is a good bet to at least get one big play in the season opener because I think the Jaguars coaches are going to do everything they can to make sure that happens, just in terms of both making other defensive coordinators respect him, but then also just to continue to give Thomas Jr. more confidence. Doesn't sound like McDaniel will let that happen. Yeah, I think you might be right about that. McDaniel was obviously talking up Thomas Jr. and has respect for him. And so maybe Miami will be a little bit better prepared for Thomas's speed just because they spent so much time on him in the pre-draft process. But with that said, like we haven't seen a ton from Thomas Jr. and so it'll be hard to game plan against him considering it's going to be his first NFL game. Catherine Richter says BTJ going to have 5 for a hundo and a tutty. I like 5 catches for a hundo and a tutty. I think that makes sense. Like 1 40-yard touchdown and then 4 catches for 60. I don't know. Yeah, I think 5 for 100 yards and a touchdown isn't completely unrealistic, but certainly wouldn't expect super high reception totals from Thomas Jr. in most games this season. All right, we got 2 more clips to play. This next one is from Fred Taylor on 1010XO's The Drill, which is 6 a.m. to 10 a.m. every weekday morning. Big news for The Drill. ET just returned after sustaining an injury during pickleball. And so happy to have ET back. And here's what Fred Taylor had some interesting things to say about Devin Lloyd on The Drill earlier this week.
Did he not meet the expectations that Ryan Nielsen would have in his defense? Or is Muma just was he misused or mislabeled or maybe perhaps was hurt for last year?
You know what? Devin Lloyd has been one of those players that you put an asterisk beside. He has the ability. Mm-hmm. I've heard some whispers somewhere where people question his studying ability in the classroom. Mm-hmm. That he's not always up on his assignments. And I don't want to put any bad information out there.
Right.
But I did hear some whispers tweaking out of the building. So, I don't know, man. He's talented, a fast, speedy guy. He's pretty athletic. You would think, okay, he can, fill the role. But you got to go out there and compete.
I don't really want to try to spread negative, unconfirmed information, but like the whole kind of point of this segment, Top Quotes, is just for me to share what I find interesting. And I think that was pretty interesting and worth bringing up. Our last clip comes from the Athletic Football Show with Robert Mays and Derek Klassen talking about the Jaguars' run game.
How do we get more efficiency in other areas of this? Because they were awful running the ball last year. Like they were so bad running the ball. And I think that was one of the biggest problems they had on offense. So I think the solutions to this is going to be leaning into a little bit more outside zone as their primary run. Because they just tried to run a little bit of everything last year, and they never really figured out what they were good at. This team had 287 gun runs last season, which was the 7th most in the NFL. They were 29th in the NFL in EPA per carries on those runs. They were 32nd in the percentage of those runs that went for 0 or negative yardage. So they lost more value on those runs than just about any other team in the league. So I think trying to eject some of that and play a little bit more under center and just this is what we're going to work on. This is what we're going to focus on. I think that can benefit the run game. And the other thing this benefits is the passing game, because I think that one of the things they're going to try to do to just hone their offensive identity and seek out more explosives. And we've already seen it in the preseason. I think we're going to see a lot more play action from this team, especially under center. And for multiple different reasons, I actually think that is a very smart path forward for them.
So Mays is a great analyst, and he said a lot of great things in that clip. The main thing I want to focus on, though, is him saying that the Jaguars want to major in outside zone. And I think that's interesting probably because I think Mays is a great analyst, but also because he was at Jaguars camp for a day or two, and he's definitely kind of a well-plugged – he's not an insider, but he's almost an insider because he has a lot of connections. And so I think he's probably been talking to people within the building, and it's not like that's just a hunch that the Jaguars are going to be running more outside zone. And I think it's interesting just to specify outside zone because Press Taylor was talking earlier in the offseason about how the Jaguars, one of the ways that they wanted to, quote, fix the run game was just by kind of simplifying it and not putting too much on like offensive players' plate. And the past 2 years under Taylor and Doug Peterson, the Jaguars have had a really diverse run scheme, but it's almost been too diverse, like diverse to a fault, because they just are so spread out and not really focused on one thing. So they don't really excel at one thing. And so I'm not sure if Peterson wanted a diverse run game just to be able to like have a bunch of different answers for whatever the defense might be throwing at him, or if he was maybe just having a diverse run game because he was throwing stuff at the wall and just seeing what types of runs stuck and what types of runs the Jaguars were best at doing. And so now we kind of have a good feeling that Jaguars want to be an outside zone team, similar to the McVay and Shanahan trees, even if Doug Peterson is very much from the Andy Reid coaching tree, which is kind of more like West Coast timing concepts or whatever. But yeah, expect to see a higher rate of outside zone for the Jaguars this season. We got two more quotes. The first one is from Steven Ruiz of The Ringer. He recently ranked the quarterbacks in the NFL going into the 2024 season. He had Trevor Lawrence 8th behind only Patrick Mahomes, Lamar Jackson, Josh Allen, Justin Herbert, Matthew Stafford, and Dak Prescott. And Steven said in his profile of Trevor Lawrence, quote, Lawrence's robust skill set is the only thing that's keeping Jacksonville's offense above water. His quick processing and talented arm may get him into trouble on more challenging plays, but those features shine on quick, timing-based passes. He manages the pocket as well as any quarterback in the league, and he moves well for a big man, rarely getting out of position to make a throw, which allows him to get passes off as soon as he makes a decision. There are no delays there. He's an athletic passer who can make off-platform throws on the run. He can place downfield passes with precision, and he's one of the sharper quarterbacks in the league before the snap. Lawrence is everything you want in a quarterback except for those pesky results. So I'm a huge fan of Ruiz. He might be my favorite NFL analyst out there. Would definitely recommend going to see or read his full profile on Lawrence, as well as just his work on the quarterback rankings in general for The Ringer. Last thing to get to was just news that K'Lavon Chaisson was released by the Carolina Panthers on Wednesday. Mike Kay, who formerly covered the Jaguars a long time ago, he's now with the Charlotte Observer covering the Panthers, and he tweeted that Panthers head coach Dave Canales was asked why K'Lavon Chaisson didn't work out. He said Chaisson carved out a nice role on special teams, but they wanted someone dynamic as an edge rusher. So tough for K'Lavon. I think one of the most interesting what-ifs in Jaguars history, at least recent history, is what if the Jaguars had selected Justin Jefferson instead of his former LSU teammate K'Lavon Chaisson in the first round of that 2020 NFL draft. But Justin Jefferson is such a good player that he probably would have elevated the team enough that they wouldn't have been in position to draft Trevor Lawrence the following year. So it's kind of interesting there. Let's see what Rachel says. They blew up so much smoke Chaisson early in the offseason too, but the miraculous turnaround didn't happen. Yeah, there was some smoke about Chaisson coming out of like Panthers camp earlier in the offseason, but I think it was less about Chaisson and just more about the rest of the depth chart. Like, oh, Chaisson might actually be expected to start across from Jadeveon Clowney just because they have no one else really on the edge that's notable after Brian Burns was traded to the Giants in the offseason. So, yeah. Now it's time for some chat therapy. Let's see if there was any other quotes that I didn't get to, but this is just the part where you ask me any other questions you have about the Jaguars in their upcoming game with the Dolphins. I think at the top we were talking about rushing. Raisha said, I imagine how good it'll feel for Etienne and Bigsby if they get holes to run through. It'll be like running downhill after running uphill most of last season. It's a good way of putting it, honestly. I think there's a lot of bad stats out there for the Jags running game last year. One of the for sure is that the Jags finished bottom 5, in yards before average yards before contact, meaning that the Jags were just kind of blown up in the backfield a lot last year. And so if they're able to just get to the line of scrimmage without being touched this year, that could really go a long way. Rob Thompson said, Defoe in response, sure, I saw a stat that last season almost all of Etienne's rushing yards were after contact. I think that's probably true. I think he was definitely one of the leaders in just yards after contact in general. But then I think if you make it kind of a rate of like how the percentage of his rushing yards that were after contact, I'm sure it would be one of the top in the league. I think Etienne is also a little bit underrated in that regard, at least outside of Jacksonville, because he's kind of known as like this speed threat, this dynamic guy, this like almost Alvin Kamara type back was like the main comparison to him coming out of Clemson. But man, his contact balance is one of the best parts of his game, and he's really able to shed tacklers. It's really easy. He's usually makes the first two guys miss, not just the first guy miss. And so I think I said on last Tuesday's show, a quote that I like about Etienne is that he's inevitable as a runner. And so I think if he's able to get some better lanes this season, then Pro Bowl nod could be inevitable as well. Gracious asked earlier, so we might see Buster Brown more than we expect on Sunday, huh? I'm not sure when you sent this comment, so I don't know what it was commenting on, but I would be pretty surprised if we saw Buster Brown on Sunday. I think Ronald Darby and Tyson Campbell are locked in as pretty much full-time players as outside corners, and then Darnell Savage is going to be in the slot a ton. Those are kind of like your 3 cornerback starters, and then I guess Monteric Brown is probably going to be the cornerback 4 right now, above Jarian Jones maybe. But I honestly wouldn't expect to see a single snap from Buster Brown on Sunday, bar injury. Bloody D Vox asked, do you think this is the most talented team the Jaguars have ever put on the field? I'm sure this question was related to Shad Khan's statements. I mean, really everyone has said it. Shad Khan has said it this offseason. Doug Peterson has said it this offseason. Trevor Lawrence has said it this offseason. Maybe they're kind of echoing each other in a way, but they all have said that this is the best team and most talented roster that the Jaguars have put together, especially in the past 5 years or so, or really since Trevor Lawrence got here. And so, yeah, I think this is – I'm trying to think about the 2017 team, like which roster was better. That defensive roster was obviously nuts, and like Gus Bradley's scheme is sound, but really that was a case of, I think, talent being better than the scheme. Man, there was just a lot of dudes on that defense, but the offense kind of had, I mean, Blake Bortles as a starter, Leonard Fournette, who had a nice rookie year in 2017, but obviously didn't last with the Jags for a super long time. So I think just front to bottom in terms of the whole depth chart, even though the Jaguars' defense was clearly better in 2017, I like the current roster right now. I'm not old enough to remember like the 99 team or the 98 team. I mean, I was born in 99, so I'm not sure about all that, but this is the most talented team I can personally remember seeing the Jags put together. I think their defense is really going to kind of outperform league-wide or like national expectations just because they've accumulated so much athleticism and talent on that side of the ball. And I was a fan of Mike Caldwell, but I think they're really going to be able to kind of unleash it under Ryan Nielsen, just with the amount of coaching and technique, discipline, and just development from him and his staff. I think just that combination of like coaching, technique, and then just having freak athletes is going to mesh really well and just come together for the defense sooner than expected. And then lastly, the special teams unit for Jacksonville. I mean, there's kind of a big question mark with Cam Little. When he was first drafted, I think I gave it like a D grade for Big Cat Country. And it had nothing to do with Cam Little, the player, but more so just that kicker is such a difficult position to nail down. As hard as it is to find a starting quarterback in the league, it's even harder to find a starting kicker. And so the analytics will tell you it's probably not worth spending a draft pick on a kicker, even if it is a 6th round. But everything we've seen from Cam Little so far this offseason has been outstanding. They also added Devin Duvernay, who's a former All-Pro return man, to replace Jamal Agnew. And then Logan Cook has always been one of the best punters in the league, like always a top 10 kind of guy. And so I think the special teams unit is definitely going to be somewhere between average and above average. But if they're able to actually be like one of the kind of leading teams in terms of just kind of scheming up for the new kickoff rules, and they're able to kind of like build an advantage based off of that, we've been encouraged by what we've seen from the Jaguars' kickoff in the preseason and stuff. I think they definitely have the potential to leap from top 16 special teams unit to top 5 even. And so again, front to back, this is the best Jaguars team that I've seen in my life. Let's see if we have anything else. I think that is going to be it for today. We went over an hour. The show was actually supposed to be like 30 or 40 minutes, so maybe I'll do a little bit less quotes, even though I like doing those. I think they're pretty insightful. But yeah, that's kind of it. I don't know. I like the intro that I have. I don't really have a good outro, so I don't know. I guess this will just sort of end.